The Maple Leafs will try to figure out how to replace the productivity of Mitch Marner. The Utah Mammoth look to make the playoffs for the first time in a while, and the San Jose Sharks are trying to take the next step in their rebuild. We've got all of this and more on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Gil Martin here. Welcome, everybody, to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss an episode. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com and win $300 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the co-host of Locked On Leafs, David Morassutti. And David, it's been an interesting offseason for the Toronto Maple Leafs, but I guess the biggest question is, how do you replace the productivity of a Mitch Marner?
I mean, it's not easy, right? You're talking about a guy who had his first 100-point season, right? 102 points, a valuable playmaker, played on the penalty kill as well. So just brought that two-way ability. It's going to be a lot of internal, right? They're going to need some guys to take steps forward. You know, I look at a Matthew Nyes. You know, they just gave him a nice, juicy contract extension. He's someone that's going to have to expect it to play, you know, a bigger role. I expect a guy like William Nylander, who, you know, he signed an $11.5 million contract extension a year ago. He led the Leafs in goals. Now I think he's going to have to do a little bit more. I think they're going to have to trust him to take a bigger role. You know, this offseason. I look at a guy like Max Domi, who, you know, hasn't exactly been the most productive forward. You know, he's filled in. He's had to play so many different roles. I'm hoping that maybe, you know, if they can get him playing with Austin Matthews, he's not going to get the Marner production, but if he even can get half of what Mitch Marner provided, I think it's, you know, it'll at least help alleviate some of it. But yeah, I mean, there are not many teams are able in this day and age are able to replace a 102-point player. You know, one that especially left, you know, and you didn't get much back in return.
Is there one player in the Leafs lineup that you think will be hurt most by Marner's departure?
Everyone thinks it's going to be Austin Matthews. There's going to be a degree to it. Like, you know, when he scored 69 goals, he played with Marner and he also didn't play with Marner. So I do think that there's going to be an adjustment to Austin Matthews' game. You know, he's not going to have that premier playmaker. Now, they could give him another playmaker to work with. You know, they brought in Matias Michelli. They brought in, and they still have a Max Domi, two guys who are known as pass first, playmaking type players. I do think I think the obvious answer would be Austin Matthews just because of how those two work together, and they were the duo for so many years. So I'll probably stick with that because there's really nobody else that Marner played with that he had that as much of an impact on than Austin Matthews.
What would you consider the best move that the Maple Leafs made this offseason?
Best move? You know, some will probably say the re-signings that they did with Tavares and Nyes, but I'm going to go a little different because they did make a nice trade kind of a few weeks after free agency, and they got Dakota Joshua from Vancouver for a fourth-round pick, 2028 fourth-round pick. Like, you're looking deep into the reserves onto what that could potentially be like a player in terms of a prospect. But Dakota Joshua it's interesting because he was originally drafted by the Leafs. They weren't going to be able to sign him. They traded him to St. Louis, and obviously playing with Craig Berube in St. Louis, he had really good numbers in Vancouver when he played a middle six role. It's more as a third liner. Like, he's somebody that once scored 18 goals in a season, which doesn't sound like a whole lot, but as a guy who contributed on a third line role, playing that limited minutes and able to put up 18 goals, I think is actually pretty good. He had 8 points in 13 games. The last time he was in the playoffs with Vancouver too. So like, he is such a valuable lower in the lineup contributor, which is something the Leafs desperately need. And his type of the way he plays is exactly the type of player Craig Berube loves. Hard to play against, pain in the rear. He's going to hit everything in sight. But what I like about him is, as I said, he's not just a guy that's going to do bring the physicality. He's also going to pot you a couple goals, right? He can find some contributions lower in the lineup. So that's where I do like that move. Is it their best move? They really didn't do that much, right? A lot of the moves were done last year. So I do think that his addition is going to make a difference in helping provide an identity for that third line. So I do think that's probably one of the more underrated moves that they did in the offseason.
How important is getting John Tavares back this year, especially at the hometown discount that he offered the team?
Well, that's it, right? The hometown discount. Yeah, you gave a guy in his mid 30s a 4-year deal, but at a sweetheart number that, with the cap going up, he could have gotten more. We've seen guys, you see what people made in free agency right now on the term that they got, and Tavares didn't want to do that. He wanted to stay in Toronto, still getting a decent, he just came off a deal where he got paid $11 million a year. He got his money. He's still getting paid. It's not like he went for league minimum. And what this does is it not only allows Leafs to do stuff, have the cap space during the season. If they want to add some of the deadline, they can. But next year, if some of the free agents that we're seeing for next year actually end up to the open market, Toronto's going to have ample amount of cap space to go out and add. Like when we're talking about losing a Mitch Marner, it's going to sting for this year. But if you're able to find a top free agent in next year, you're going to thank John Tavares for taking the contract that he did, because even if down the road he becomes your third line center, maybe there's a second line center that's available, or even a first line center, like 1A, 1B with Austin Matthews that you can go and get in free agency next year. Like it just allows for so much flexibility that it's probably the best contract that the Leafs have gotten signed with one of their current players, because the Leafs finally got the player to concede a bit and not take everything that they wanted.
Training camp is approaching very soon, maybe a week and a half away. What are the biggest questions and concerns you have about this team as we get ready to open camp?
I obviously, who's going to play on the top line? Who is taking Mitch Marner's spot? Right, that's going to be the biggest question for Craig Berube. He's going to be asked about it. He's going to probably try to skirt around the issue until he really has to properly name somebody. That's probably the big one. The other one is, the blue line, right? They have a decent blue line, but can Morgan Rielly bounce back? Is Morgan Rielly, was last year kind of a, okay, not a great year, but let's see if he can bounce back, because he's paid a decent amount of money and the production wasn't there, and he really struggled under Craig Berube. Can Craig Berube find a way to make Morgan Rielly a better player than he was last year?
Do you think that those two can be on the same page as far as the style they want to play?
I think so. I think Berube understood that he's got to let Morgan Rielly be a little more free as an offensive defenseman. Now that he has Brandon Carlo on his pairing, is essentially that's what I expected to be. Last year they tried Tanev, but now they wanted that Tanev McCabe shutdown pairing. So if you can get Rielly to play with a Carlo, and Carlo can help solidify that pairing defensively, maybe that takes a bit of pressure off of Morgan Rielly to feel like he has to carry the burden in that role. So I'm hoping that Craig Berube doesn't put too much of the onus on Rielly to be the defensive stalwart of that pairing. He isn't going to be that. It is going to be a guy like Carlo. But I'm hoping that Morgan Rielly understands that he needs to be better. I think he probably understands that himself, but they do really need him to be a better version of himself. I do think, I do think that Berube really respects what Rielly brings. But at the same time, he has, I think, clearly adjust his expectations for a player like Morgan Riley.
Be interesting to see how that plays out over the course of the season. David, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Yeah, you can find the Locked On Leafs podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to us on YouTube. You can find myself on X at D_Morassutti, 2 S's, 2 T's. So you can find me there, and you can find my co-host Mike DeStefano there too at Mickey_Canuck.
All right, David, thank you so much.
Appreciate it, Gil. Thanks.
Today's episode is brought to you by your friends at FanDuel. The NFL season is almost here, and FanDuel is making sure you're ready for kickoff with a can't-miss offer. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your first bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. I love using FanDuel because it fits the way I like to bet. You can use player props. You could put together a same-game parlay or even jump in live as the action unfolds, and it makes every game more exciting, whether you're watching your favorite team or just keeping an eye on your fantasy lineup. So are you ready to play? Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com to get started. That's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet, and if it wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets. FanDuel.com. Check it out today. It's my pleasure to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On Sharks, JD Young. And JD, interesting offseason for the Sharks. What, in your mind, was the best move that the team made this offseason?
We'll stick to free agents because the best move was drafting Michael Misa, which was the easiest move. But we'll stick to free agency and kind of what the Sharks did this year. And I think for them trying to add some more NHL caliber players, especially along the blue line, they signed Dmitry Orlov. They signed John Klingberg. They claimed Nick Leddy off of waivers from the St. Louis Blues, trying to bolster up this blue line, which was horrific last year, especially with Yaroslav Askarov expecting to be the full-time NHLer this year, right? And not kind of putting Askarov in the situation where you're having to play against just poor defensemen that we've seen over the past couple of seasons. Now, all those guys do have their questions, right? Orlov looks like he might be kind of losing a bit of a step. Klingberg hasn't been able to stay healthy over the past couple seasons. And Nick Leddy, who had some injury issues last year and clearly wasn't himself. Like, all these guys do have questions, but if two of the three work out, like, this is going to be a much better defense than what San Jose trotted out last year, with the exception of maybe like Jake Wallman. So I think that just trying to kind of revamp the defense on the fly here and not locking yourself into any long-term contracts. All the defensemen other than Orlov are entering the last year of their deals. So if like they need to jettison one, it's not the end of the world type of thing. And even Orlov is only signed for 2 seasons. So I think revamping the blue line on the fly is going to make a big difference for San Jose this year.
And what move that they made in the offseason to you was a head scratcher?
Easily the Ryan Reeves trade. Henry Thrun, who, probably didn't have a future with San Jose, and he's probably going to be that kind of borderline NHL, AHL type of tweener player. But Ryan Reeves, I know he provides some grit or snarl or whatever you want to say, but the dude's fought like once last year. He plays like 8 minutes a night, and he's a bit of a progress stopper, and you could be giving that lineup opportunity to somebody else. So it wasn't my favorite move. I know they're trying to protect Celebrini and Smith and some of the young players, but when you have a guy who plays 8 minutes a night and then opens the door for his teammates for the other 52, that really was not my favorite move. We'll see. Again, he's in the last year of his deal, and who cares? And the Sharks needed to hit the cap floor, so his contract does help that a little tiny bit. So
you talked about Michael Misa and some of the prospects. Which one of them do you think makes an impact this year?
I think the big question for the Sharks this year is or at least heading into training camp, is can both Michael Misa and Sam Dickinson make the team? Michael Misa was a second overall pick this year. We'll start with him. I think he makes the team because he's just too good to go back to juniors, right? And I think he's a cleaner prospect than what Will Smith was even after a year of college. I think right now Michael Misa is a better prospect than Will Smith was at this time last year. And we saw how the Sharks were able to kind of navigate Will Smith last year, where the first half of the season, like he didn't play back-to-backs, hit development days, et cetera, et cetera. And then the second half of the year, in the last 34 games, he had 30 points. Only Mac Celebrini had one more point than him during that time. So I think they'll be able to kind of navigate that with Misa, and with as a forward, it's a little bit easier to kind of hide him. He can probably start on the third line, and then, as he kind of gets more comfortable and kind of jump up into the top six. Sam Dickinson's a tough one, right? Because he went back last year. He had an amazing season with London. He was the OHL Defenseman of the Year. He was the CHL Defenseman of the Year. He helped lead London to a OHL championship and a Memorial Cup. And he's done basically everything you can in juniors, but he's in that unfortunate situation where he's already signed his ELC last year and he can't go to college. He's not old enough to play in the AHL. So it's either OHL or the NHL. And it's much tougher to hide a 19-year-old defenseman than it is to hide a forward. So he's the intriguing one. I think the Sharks are going to give him every opportunity to win a job and not just pass the 9 games, but stick around this year in the NHL, because I think if he goes back to the juniors, it's going to be like a big fish in a small pond. And he's just I don't want to say waste a year, but it kind of feels like he's going to waste a year back in juniors. So those are the 2 guys who I'm really intrigued to see if they can make the team out of camp. As for some of the other prospects like Igor Chernyshov's, Quentin Mussy, I expect those guys to spend some time in the AHL before making their NHL debut, probably later on in the season, to be honest. So,
is there one thing in your mind that Dickinson needs to work on to improve in order to successfully stay in the NHL this year?
For him, it's always it's that processing speed, and you could see it in the juniors and stuff, but and he got better as the season went on, but like processing the speed at the NHL level, the only way to get better at that is to play NHL games, right? So like he's not going to be able to kind of work on that in the OHL because the speed of the game just isn't anywhere near the NHL. So that for me is the thing that he needs to work on. Like he skates beautiful. He's like a great skater. He's 6'3", 210 pounds, like as a 19-year-old kid. Like I think he's physically mature enough to hang around, and I think his skating will get him out of trouble. But sometimes he does like try to do a little bit too much. And that's always kind of the case with young players as they make that move to the NHL, is what can I get away with in the NHL that I could get away with in the OHL or the whatever. But like, I think for him is that processing speed, but unfortunately, like he's not going to be able to really improve that until he plays against bigger, faster, tougher competition. So
yeah, got to do it to prove you could do it.
Got to do it. Yep.
Exactly. So what are the realistic expectations for the Sharks this year? It will be a successful season if...
I think we'll start with the win-loss column. I think if this team is just like, you can't be the worst team in the NHL again, right? You cannot three-peat. I know Florida's going for their three-peat. We're trying to avoid a three-peat over here. You cannot be the worst team in the NHL again, because I think if you are the worst team in the NHL, it leads to a lot of questions, right? And especially with Askarov, who you paid a small bounty for to get from Nashville last year. You let him kind of marinate one more season. It's supposed to be his time, right? And he's supposed to be your answer in goal. If he's not, and that's probably leads to you losing a lot of games this year. So I think if the Sharks are a team that's, maybe they finished with 52 points last year. If you're like that 65-70, like a 20-point jump, I think that's a successful season for them. And of course, the development of the young players, right? If Celebrini can continue to take the steps he can, if Will Smith can solidify himself as a top 6, center. Right now, they're going to try him at center. So if he can be a center this year, if not, if he needs to move back to wing, kind of have some answers there. But like, you can't be the worst team in the NHL. So my hope is this team kind of makes that like a Ducks-like jump. Where instead of picking the worst team in the NHL, maybe you're like 8th, 9th worst in the NHL, and you start to have a lot of more answers than you do have questions going into next offseason.
And then to be a playoff contender in another year, 2 years? Where are we at?
I think then you kind of going into next offseason where the Sharks will have a ton of cap space again. They can be aggressive. You can start to add, you feel like you have your core with Eklund and Celebrini and Smith and hopefully Dickinson and all these other guys. And then you can start to add some longer term veteran guys where you're not just adding guys for a year or two to kind of fill in the roster, guys who you can think can contribute and start to kind of push. So the hope is, right, you make kind of a Ducks-like jump this year, and then next year maybe you're starting to kind of flirt with the wild card spot that was that 26-27 season. So
all right, we'll see how that works out. JD, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Of course, you can listen and watch wherever you get podcasts. Watch on YouTube as well. Follow the show on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at Locked On Sharks. Follow me on Twitter and Blue Sky at My Fry Hole.
All right, JD, thanks so much.
Always a pleasure, Gil.
It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the co-host of Locked On Mammoth, Robin Liano. And Robin, it's been an interesting offseason for the Mammoth. And, you know, it looks like the experts are kind of mixed as to whether this was a successful offseason or an unsuccessful offseason. What's your take?
I think that they did that the Utah Mammoth did everything that they needed to do for the offseason to become more competitive a competitive team this next year. And what's interesting is, like, people I think were expecting a huge swing, you know, them to buy all in. And my answer to them is saying that Bill Armstrong has a schedule. He knows exactly what's coming up each year in the rebuild that they've been a part of that dates back to when they were still the Arizona Coyotes. And he's sticking to that to the core. And some people don't like it. Other people they're bought in. It's in Bill we trust. Here we go.
Patience is a virtue, I guess. What do you think was the best move this team made during the offseason?
I mean, I think it's without a doubt, no question about it, was the trade for JJ Peterka. I mean, when you acquire a top 6 forward of JJ Peterka's magnitude, it's a big enough deal. Not only was it a trade, it was a trade, and it was a sign-in trade. You know, getting Peterka for a long-term deal there. Really not really having to give up all that much. They gave up Michael Kessering and Josh Stone for JJ Peterka. And yes, sure, that Kessering had some promise for a defenseman, but for the most part was Utah's defense, Utah's blue line is already overstacked. There's only so much room you can provide for anybody on the blue line. And Josh Stone was in and out between the fourth line and the Tucson Roadrunners in the American Hockey League, and he was finding his place, but that was an expendable pick. He was a fan favorite for sure, but at the end of the day, when you're able to get a top 6 forward like JJ Peterka, that's what you go for it.
And which move during the offseason had you scratching your head the most?
Had me scratching my head. Well, it's interesting because it was actually, to me, more of a re-sign. And it was because this goes back to before the season ended, Gil. And before the season ended, around the time even when it ended, Michael Carcone had kind of already said he was on his way out. He didn't really have any interest in returning to the Utah Mammoth. And it seemed to be the common opinion that he wasn't going to come back. After a few weeks after free agency kind of rolls on, hey, surprise, surprise, he is back and going to be wearing a Utah Mammoth jersey. And I kind of scratched my head a little bit on this one because I was like, okay, so yeah, sure, you might have not found the deals you were looking for, but what kind of role are you going to play here? Because there's already this team is getting stacked by as we continue to go, and as we continue to go, it's like, are you going to be an extra forward? Are you going to be what are you going to be? Are you going to spend most of your season in the press box as a scratch? Like, to me, I have hopes for Michael Carcone. I like him, but I wondered whether or not he had the right fit with this squad.
We'll find out over the course of the season. You know, the Utah franchise has been building up prospects for several years. Are there any players who you feel are on the verge and ready to make an impact this year?
Yeah, there are, and I would say go ahead. There are two guys who are on the top of so many people's list right now, and they were paying attention to these guys because they were signed and they are making their way on over to North America from the KHL. And I'm talking about defenseman Dmitry Shimashev and forward Daniel Boot. They were teammates over in the KHL, and now they're going to be teammates here in Utah. They might start the season in Tucson, but what's expected is these guys are going to make a huge impact. Anyone who has watched either one of these, and whether it's Dev Camp, maybe watched their game in the KHL, knows that these guys are big, physical guys that fit the Bill Armstrong mold, and they're ready for the next step.
Who do you think would come out of the lineup if those guys come in?
I think that it's interesting because I've already said that the blue line is already kind of full. There's very little room in the blue line. However, I think that Dmitry Shimashev is the most equipped to be able to take a spot as the opening night roster, potentially on the blue line. Not to say nothing against Daniel Boo. I feel like he's got so much going for him. I'd like to see as a forward. I want to see him kind of see what he does as a forward in the North American game a little bit more before we make any adjustments or any decisions there. And I mean, that's what training camp's for, but we'll have to find out. I'm hopeful for both of them. I think both of them are going to make a really big impact, whether it's in Tucson, like as like top guys in Tucson, or moving in along the lineup and with the Utah Mammoth.
All right, we'll keep an eye on that. What is the buzz around Salt Lake City, around the community for year two?
I think the buzz is that this team is getting better every single year. You take a look at last year; it was around 89 points last year, just not too far away from a playoff spot. It's a well-established opinion from a lot of people here, but the Central Division is very strong. There's a lot of people that they have to overcome to be able to get into the Central Division or get into the Stanley Cup playoffs next season. But that's also the expectation for them. I feel like from that is they're knowing that, okay, this is a playoff year for us. Even the players, some of the players, I think even Clayton Keller has said himself, it's playoff or bust, essentially. Like they want to make sure they want to get into the playoffs this next season. And with the squad that they have this next year, I think that's the expectation. That's what's expected of them this year. The talent's only getting better. Clayton Keller is getting another season as a captain. I mean, not only captain of the Utah Mammoth, but I mean, over the summer, he captained Team USA to their first gold medal in the World Championship since 1933. So I've had something to say about what he can do, what you can expect out of a leadership from someone like him as well. So there's a lot to be excited for from this team next year.
And what is the biggest thing that has to happen for them to realize that expectation and make the playoffs this year?
It's interesting because it is the biggest cop-out of an answer to say this, but it's all about health. Really, it is all about health. Last year, I'm saying it again multiple different times. The blue line has experienced so much injury. Last year, Utah was out Sean Dursey for half the year. They were out Sean Marino for half the year. I believe Maverick Lamoureux, who replaced one of those players, he ended up being out a few weeks after playing for a little bit. And then more injuries and more injuries. They were down to I think, almost 10 defensemen deep or whatever it was at some point. And it was absolutely crazy. The hope is they don't have to worry about this year. The hope is we can get a full season out of John Marino, a full season out of Sean Dursey, so they can find out where they work alongside Mikhail Sergachev to see how Olimata fits in, as well as the free agent signing and Nathan Schmidt and see how he fits in. There is gonna be a lot of questions in this Utah blue line that really need to be answered before anything else.
All right, Robin, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you and your co-host on social media?
Yeah, over on social media, you can find the podcast just about everywhere on at Locked On Mammoth. That's at Locked On Mammoth. You can find me personally, I'm mostly active over on Twitter /X, whatever people want to call it these days, at Robin with a Y _LEANO. My co-host Tom Callahan, he's also on Twitter at Callahan On Air, but he's primarily active over on Blue Sky. You can follow him at Tom Talks.
All right, Robin, thank you so much.
Of course.
We have an important request. Locked On wants to hear from you. We've put together a survey to learn more about our listeners and make your favorite podcasts even better. This is your chance to tell us what you like, what you don't, and to answer questions about our advertising. Go to lockedonpodcast.com/survey to get started. Everyone who completes a survey will be entered for a chance to win one of 10 $100 Amazon gift cards. Again, that's lockedonpodcast.com/survey. You could also find the link in the show notes, and thanks for helping out. I want to thank my guest, David Morassutti from Locked On Leafs. I want to thank JD Young of Locked On Sharks, and of course, Robin Leano of Locked On Mammoth for joining me today. I'm Gil Martin. I host the Monday edition of Locked On NHL, and I co-host the Friday edition along with Rachel Donner. Don't forget, we're here 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday, bringing you the biggest stories from around the world of hockey all year long. Have a great day, everybody. Stay safe. Enjoy the holiday weekend. And thanks for listening to and watching the Locked On NHL podcast.